So are there any questions about that last time, or is everyone okay with it? We'll go on. I want to talk about Hitler today. Now, a lot of biographies of Hitler, and there are a lot of psychoanalytic studies of Hitler, and I think most people agree that we still don't really understand Hitler. So I'm not going to pretend, or the Holocaust. I'm not going to pretend that this is somehow a finished piece of work. It's in process, and maybe you'll come up with ideas of your own. Because when we try and understand a phenomenon like Hitler and the Holocaust and the Second World War in general, there are many different aspects to it. There's the psychology, which is very important, but there are also historical and economic and cultural and social factors going on, and they're all interacting with each other, so it's very complicated. There's a big controversy about whether psychological approaches are any use. A lot of the first historians to write about Hitler hated psychohistory. Psychohistory is the attempt to apply psychological theories to history. And when you look at the early psychoanalytic accounts, you can see why they hated it. Some of the early psychoanalytic attempts to understand Hitler are just frankly stupid. I'll tell you what they are. There's one theory that when he was a child, he peed into the mouth of a goat and had part of his penis bitten off, and that upset him terribly, and that's why the Holocaust. You heard that? Well, that kind of stuff. So because of those kind of trivial theories, yeah, that explains it. The whole psychohistory field kind of had a bad name for a long time. And the other thing is that what's called the great man theory of history is not popular anymore. The great man theory of history is that historical events are largely, big events like wars and so on, are largely the result of the great men or women or people who started them. This is not a popular idea. Nowadays, people are more interested in the interaction of economics, social factors, ideology, and so on. It's not just one person. Now, my interest in Hitler, one should is a rather big word. One can always trace one's interest in things to one's own background. My father is a concentration camp survivor, so I grew up in the shadow of that whole Holocaust problem. And it's very common, as you may have even experienced this yourself, that when your parents can't solve a problem, they pass it on to you. They say, "Look, I'm sorry, I can't deal with this. You deal with it." Of course, nobody in that generation could really deal with it very well. So when I was growing up, it was this kind of great black cloud over everything. So I've always been interested in it because it affected my life so much. So this is really so naturally, when I got interested in psychology, I was interested in that area. So it's kind of personal as well as professional for me. Now, the first thing is that when we try and understand a character like Hitler psychologically, we're not trying to exonerate him. Okay, we're not trying to take him off the hook. There's the old French saying, "To understand all is to forgive all." Well, in this case, that won't apply. In fact, some people really resent the attempt to understand Hitler psychologically. You'll see sometimes in some of the biographies pictures of Hitler as a baby dressed in these little white frilly baby dresses. They dressed kids up in those days. Sort of like a long white communion gown with a frilly collar. And he looks like a little baby. And the problem is, how do you get from there to the mass murderer? You see, that's the problem. And if you are a depth psychologist and you start trying to explain, well, this happened to him and that happened to him, before long you sort of apologize. The worry is that you'll have apologized for him, and he's the victim all of a sudden. You see the problem? There are theologians, Emil Fattenheim and various other people, who say that only God can understand Hitler. Normal people fall on when you measure something in a normal person, like aggression or violence or something, you can fit them on a curve, a distribution curve. But with Hitler, everything is off the graph. He's in a class of his own. You can't understand Hitler. Well, I think that's kind of silly. I think that what we need is, I understand it, but I don't agree with it. I think that we just need better theory. We just need to keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. Because I regard this kind of phenomenon as a kind of disease. And you can't treat a disease unless you understand it. So I think we have to keep, it's really the problem of evil. So we have to keep trying to understand it, trying to understand it. I mean, the reality is obviously that the human race hasn't learned much from that. So we're still, there's still Holocausts going on ever since then. They've been not quite on as large a scale, but several similar kind of events kept happening. So it didn't change anything. So I'm not optimistic that things are changing. I just think the problem for us is to keep trying to understand it, in the hope that one day we'll understand it enough to be able to really do something about it. So I don't like the idea that we can't ever understand it. I don't know whether we'll be able to prevent it eventually, but I know that we'll never prevent it if we don't understand it. So that's why I'm here. So the argument that Hitler's not understandable, only God can understand Hitler, is called the exceptionalist argument, technically, okay? That says that Hitler, people like Hitler, maybe Stalin, that kind of character, maybe Saddam Hussein, they're not ordinary people. They're not, the rest of us, we can understand each other. We just have we're extensions of human nature. We have bits of us are exaggerated, but these people are qualitatively different. They're not ordinary. It's not ordinary badness, okay? Anyway, I just mentioned this, that there are these people who think that the attempt to understand Hitler is a kind of obscenity, because we will try to take him off the hook. One of the main people who says this is a man called Claude Lanzmann. Has anyone seen that very long documentary about the Holocaust? I think it was a 9.5 hour. It was called Shoah, S-H-O-A-H, which is the Israeli word for Holocaust. Well, this guy Lanzmann said, I don't want Hitler to be the victim of bad childhood experiences. Okay, I don't want to grant him a kind of posthumous victory by saying, oh, poor thing, couldn't help it. Okay. He says that the attitude, there's a memoir of Auschwitz of a guy called Primo Levi, and one of the prisoners asks one of the guards why all this is happening, and the guard says there is no why here. Why is just not a question that you can ask in this situation. And that's what Lanzmann says we should adopt. There is no why. He says, otherwise you become one of these revisionist deniers of what happens, trying to pretend it didn't happen. But I want to stress over and over again, I think that the idea that an explanation is an exoneration or a justification is a mistake. You can explain cancer without thinking it's a good thing.
Yeah, that's what I don't understand. It sounds like his theory is that any explanation excuses the
behavior.
But that's not true in life either. It's just a general murderer.
That's right.
Go over their experiences, but it doesn't excuse
Exactly.
Very often, about many things.
Yeah, many
People
things.
think that about child abuse, for instance, the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that's a leap that people are making.
Right,
It's not
it is.
necessarily
It is a
the
leap,
truth.
yeah.
It's a huge
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that you can ask why, and I don't think we can help asking why, how these things happen, actually. But it's not the same as excusing. But what is true for me, anyway, and I think for a lot of people, is that when you see hatred and evil that is inexplicable, it's more intolerable than hatred and evil that you understand. When you can understand it, it's a little more tolerable. That's all. Which isn't to excuse it. Yes, which isn't to excuse it. But we need some kind of explanation. Broadly speaking, you've got two kinds of explanation. You've got the kind of Alice Miller explanation that I will talk about, that talks about it in terms of his childhood, and things happen to him in his childhood. And then you've got the James Hillman kind of explanation that there's a daimon. Do you know that his soul's code? That he had a unique destiny to follow that was sort of inborn in him. Now, obviously, these two are not incompatible, but roughly speaking, those are the two levels of explanation. Now, part of the difficulty that we have trying to understand him biographically and psychologically is that, of course, now most of the eyewitnesses are gone, dead, and we don't have most of the documentation that we would really need to understand his childhood, because a lot of it was destroyed. So I think we should admit at the beginning, when we try and understand a character like Hitler, it's like a Rorschach test. Okay, it's like an ink blot. So you better be careful what you say, because we tend to project onto these. These are the. It's true with Mother Teresa and Gandhi and figures like that. We tend to project Martin Luther King, even very, very positive figures. The extremes of human nature, those are the ones that we tend to project onto. Okay. And your theory about Hitler in the end is going to depend on your theory of human nature. Do you believe in free will or not? Are you a determinist? Do you think that people can make choices about how they behave? Or do you think that everything is determined by your genes and your environment? You may as well ask yourself that question at the moment, because that's going to become very important. In other words, could he help what he did? Well, I mean, that's just true for you and me. Can we, the whole problem of evil is, can the perpetrator not have done what he did that was evil? Did he have a choice? I mean, that, in a way, the whole problem of evil hinges around that question. So when you work with somebody in the consulting room, you have to ask yourself, how much of this is determined? Sometimes people are in the grip of situations that just feel like fate, but they have no choice. And sometimes it seems as if people do have a choice. But that's a very important question. See, there are people who believe in the overwhelming power of the unconscious. They say there are forces in the personality that are overwhelming. Your rage, your hate, your aggression, your love, those kind of things. They're so powerful that really you have no choice. The bad news is, you had to marry the person you married. That kind of thing. You didn't have any choice. That's the sort of the uncontrollable forces theory of personality. Well, some people believe that. And then there are people who say, no, you have choice. See, it makes a difference. If I was a total determinist, if I thought I had no choice, I may as well get drunk and then drive home, because I don't have any choice. Well, clearly I have to behave as if I have choice. I can't, that kind of thing would not be sensible. But do I have the choice to choose? Do I have the freedom to choose? That's a big question. Okay. Well, that's the debate. Now what we know is this. We know that he had a certain personality, and his personality interacted with what was going on socially at the time. What was going on? The country had just had a big defeat in World War I. Okay? We're talking about in the 30s when Hitler came to power. People felt humiliated by the defeat. There was mass starvation. There was mass unemployment. At the end of the First World War, all these millions of men were suddenly demobilized and sent back into what would have been the workforce, except there was no work for them. So you had millions of people back from the army and with nothing to do. They were just hanging around. There was no food, no jobs. People were starving. They were bitter. They were angry. And there was mass grief. This was the cultural situation. They'd lost, I don't know how many millions of men, I never wrote it down. But they'd lost millions of people in the First World War, in the war. So there was hardly a household in Germany where there wasn't a husband or a father or a brother or a son or somebody who died. There was incredible grief, national grief, because of this. Okay? And then on top of that, 2 million people just come back from the army and with nothing to do. So they were hanging around, and a lot of them enlisted in these kind of quasi-military groups that employed soldiers or returning soldiers because they knew how to fight and so on. There was severe economic depression and grief kind of depression. So there was a kind of, the whole country was in a state of kind of national trauma. Now that kind of, you have to empathically imagine yourself into the frame of mind. It seems to me that the predominant feeling in the country was impotent rage. Now, impotent rage is one of the worst kinds of rage. Rage that you know, in a situation where you can do something is bad enough. But when you have impotent rage, where you can't do anything, it's much worse. Okay. And so there was impotent rage, grief, desperation, poverty, unemployment, and starvation. The place was an absolute mess. Okay. So when Hitler came to power, he was able to channel all those emotions and harness them in the service of his own political ambition. So that's why I say that all those cultural and economic forces and so on were all interacting with his psychology. It wasn't just a matter of his psychology. So I just mention that because that's an important background. Now, people like, normally when we want to understand a personality, we get biographical information, but people like Hitler and Stalin did whatever they could to hide their origins. They would kill people who knew anything about them in childhood because they wanted to create a myth. And if you want to create a myth about yourself, you know, the Führer myth, you don't want people around you who will actually tell the truth. You know, oh, he picked his nose and, you know, he was no good in school. You want anybody like that they could get rid of, who knew that kind of thing, they would get rid of. Okay? But here's what we do know about him. There's a story that his paternal grandmother, whose name was Maria Schicklgruber, okay, that's Schicklgruber, paternal grandmother had a baby by a Jewish man, okay, and this baby became Hitler's father, okay, so that was the grandmother. We don't know who Hitler's father's father was. The suggestion is that he was a man called Frankenberger, because this man was apparently paying money to the Schicklgruber family, either because he was being blackmailed or because he really was the father. This is all shrouded in mystery. No one knows if this story is true or not. Okay, but maybe his grandfather was a Jew. Okay. Now, if his grandfather was a Jew, that's very, very interesting. It's a little hard to pin the whole Holocaust on this poor character. But of course it's led to the theory that when Hitler was attacking the Jews, he was attacking this Jewish blood in himself, and so on. But nobody quite knows.
So she was never married, and she had
She
had an illegitimate child.
Exactly. Yeah. Who may be by a Jewish father, which was his grandfather. Yeah. His father's father.
Who was in the picture or not?
Disappeared. No, we don't know what happened to him.
It's not proven that he was.
It's not this whole story. No, the whole story is not proven.
But it is proven that she had him, that his father was illegitimate.
Probably. His father's father was. Yeah, that's right.
His father was.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And also the
sorry, go on.
The information about the money that was paid by this man named Frank,
Frankenberger. Yeah.
That is substantiated with the...
No, none of this is substantiated. Okay. This is all part of the Hitler mythology.
Okay.
Nobody's quite sure if the stories are true or not. But this is what's in the air around, you know.
Yeah.
So the idea was then, of course, that he hates that part of himself. So he attacks the Jews because he hates that part of himself, and he's enraged that he's got some Jewish blood in him in the back. The whole thing, to me, sounds very, very implausible. But I mention it because it's in some of the biographies. Needless to say, various people went back to that part of Germany, Austria, where he was born. Wiesenthal went back and looked for families with this name of Frankenberger and couldn't find anybody. There was no record. So nobody's sure if that story's true. So I don't know whether that story's true. There's another story that Hitler's grandmother was a servant in Baron Rothschild's house, the German industrialist, and that the real father of Hitler's grandfather was a Rothschild. Okay, that's another story. That story, during the Second World War, a guy called Walter Langer wrote a biography of Hitler for the American OSS. And that's the Langer story. Okay. And Langer sent, that was in the report that Langer sent to FDR during the war. Okay. No one knows if that's true either. But the interesting thing to me, what's more interesting, is that people have tried to find some poor Jewish bloke several generations back and blame the whole thing on him. What you'll find here is the need to blame somebody. Okay, that's what seems to be going on here. Let's try and hang this on somebody.
Oh, the need to find reason in something that's just terrifically inexplicable.
Yes, exactly. That's why, remember the Rorschach. This is a Rorschach. Okay. Anyway, the father, whose name was Alois, A-L-O-I-S, was certainly born out of wedlock in 1837. Okay, that much we know. We just don't know who the father's father was. But those are the rumors. Now, then she actually married somebody called Johann Heidler, and his name was H-I-E-D-L-E-R, who became his official grandfather. Okay, not the actual one, but on paper. Okay, it's not clear if he was the father of this grandfather was the father of Alois or not, if Heidler was or not. It just isn't clear.